Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today's a Q&A with some really realistic people. Our topic today is practicing realistic optimism. And our wonderful participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary now before we go into our Q&A. Optimism is only really helpful if it's grounded in reality. So we're talking about realistic optimism, a faith in the future that accepts the most inconvenient facts and always focuses on what's helpful. Our starting point is that we only experience the world through our minds. It follows, therefore, that we can positively change our experience if we can change our mindsets. And to change our mindsets, two questions are helpful. The first question is, what am I attending to? What am I selecting out of the vast array of sensory stimuli? The second question is, how am I paying attention? What's the manner or style of my thinking? Now, the most important implication of this is that there are choices we can make that change our life experience no matter what reality confronts us. And a simple way to understand this is via the equation R plus M equals E, or reality plus mindset equals experience. Let's start with what I'm paying attention to. What we shouldn't do is focus on things that concern us that are outside our circle of influence. Our experience then will be one of helplessness and hopelessness. For example, we may spend too long watching mainstream media and too long doom scrolling through social media. What should we attend to instead? We ought to shift our attention to things that reflect our higher values and purposes and that we can do something useful about, like exercising or focusing on our work or telling our beloved how much we love them. Secondly, the way we think about events changes our experience of reality. So here's an everyday example. Traffic incidents. The triggering reality might be that someone cuts in on you without indicating. And there's no thank you wave either. You respond by hitting the brakes, your heart rate jumps, but you then might become angry with them. You might swear out loud at them, indulge in hand gestures, etc. But perhaps the very next day, virtually the same thing happens. You have the initial anxiety and automatic response, but then it's like water off a duck's back. You're relaxed. So how can the same reality lead to such different outcomes? Well, obviously the answer is different mindsets. The same reality, but a changed mindset leads to a changed experience. So a very powerful way to edit or improve our mindset is to catch ourselves in the act of pessimism. Compared to realistic pessimists, people who orient to the world with realistic optimism are healthier, they catch less diseases, they live longer, they're more successful, and they're happier in relationships. And there are three styles of thought, the so-called 3 Ps of pessimism, that make life's difficulties worse than they need be. For example, we may make such events more permanent by using language such as, "I'll never get a job," and this always happens. Or we might make them more pervasive by seeing them as a part of everything's going wrong or nothing's going right. Or we might make them too personal by automatically blaming ourselves. Now, on the other hand, by making adverse events more temporary, less pervasive, and not about myself, we can open up the benefits of realistic optimism. And finally, another powerful tool in building realistic optimism is the 2 conditions test. So, next time you experience any negative emotion, ask yourself 2 questions. First, ask yourself, is my thinking realistic? Is it an exaggeration or overgeneralization? If it's not realistic, you should drop the upset. But if it is realistic, next ask yourself, is my thinking helpful? Is it wise or constructive? Not many upsets survive this second question answered honestly. So to sum up, it's been my sad observation that generally people would rather be right than happy. So my advice to you is to challenge your mindsets and see if you can learn to rather be happy than right. Okay, so that's by way of summary of the podcast that my good friends have watched, and let's join them now in the Q&A. And as always, I'm impatient with curiosity about what you took from the video of the podcast, and I'll leave it open to who's really impatient to jump in first with their insights and questions. Who might that be?
Well, I'm very curious.
Okay, excellent.
In listening to the podcast, there was two situations that came up for me. One a work situation, one a personal relationship situation. In that, I believe those individuals to need a shift in mindset. But maybe if we're not having too much of an understanding of their circle of influence in thinking about coaching, perhaps, like what would you suggest as a strategy to steer them away from the 3 Ps? How could you help them to like kind of gain control of that experience?
Okay, fantastic. And of course, it's generally speaking, it's more common that it'll be 1 or 2 of the Ps rather than all 3, right? So if the first thing would be to be listening in such a way, are they making it more pervasive? Or are they making it more permanent? Or is the problem that they over-blame themselves for negative outcomes, right? Because sometimes they'll do the opposite on the 3rd P. They won't take enough responsibility. And Martin Seligman, the guy who came up with this idea, who spent decades working on it, on the personal dimension, the optimal place is to be sort of in the middle or average. So sometimes we ought to blame ourselves for bad things. So first thing is, where are they being pessimistic? In what way? And in coaching them, they're probably unaware of that. All right. And if they don't know you're coaching them, like if it's just a conversation you're having, you can subtly edit their language, reflecting it back to them. So if they're saying everything's stuffed, you might reflect it back to say, so this is stuffed and this is stuffed, right? So you're moving them from everything to these things. Because remember, this is realistic optimism. If there are things that are a problem, we can soften the effect by making it more specific, in this case, less pervasive, right? And so although it's not going to necessarily make them happy, it's going to be moving them quite, and then you say, tell me the things, or when did it happen? And then you can maybe point out when it's not happening, and then you can maybe have a collaborative conversation about, well, what's the difference between these 2 times or these 2 situations? All right. So it's sort of reducing that overgeneralization and getting them to focus on it. Now, if it's more formal coaching, like if you've actually got permission to talk to them about this, you could share the 3 Ps with them, and say, what do you think? But that's a different interpersonal situation, isn't it? But maybe one that you come across in your role, in human resources.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and approaching something like that from that coaching standpoint with the permission to be a coach could perhaps help them move away from their rightness, which can be a challenge. But
yeah, but maybe you could play the podcast to them as well.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. That's great, Karen. Who's next?
Karen, it's really interesting because I went to a very, very similar train of thought, which was interpersonal, and in particular, interpersonal conflict, where we think back to the R, or what is it, mindset and experience.
Reality plus mindset equals experience.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
the reality might be the same, and it might be the two different mindsets that cause the friction or the conflict in the first place.
Yeah.
That lead to those, those two different experiences, and trying to reconcile that gap between those two different experiences becomes part of the challenge. And you've spoken, I think, on previous podcasts about that. Is it helpful? Is it realistic kind of process, which I find personally really, really useful. Anytime I find myself in any sort of spiral, is like that meta thought process of saying, okay, is this pathway that I'm going down, is it realistic? Is it helpful? As you say, usually it doesn't satisfy those two conditions. But also, if I were to trot that out in a moment of conflict and say, well, is your thinking helpful and is it realistic? It's sort of like asking an angry person to calm down, right? It's going to have the opposite impact. And so, this is maybe a slightly different twist on Karen's approach, but is like in those moments of conflict, is there a way that we can help nudge that person to be thinking about their own or lack of objectivity, perhaps, in the situation?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say here is that, one of the implications of that equation is that we're all operating in terms of interpretations of the world. None of us have got like pristine access to the reality. It's always filtered through our mind. So there should be what, you could call epistemic humility, some humility around what we know. And so in approaching it, I think that, as you say, we've got two people with the same reality, but they're just seeing it very differently. And of course, both parties think they're seeing it correctly. And if there's important things on the line here, reputation or, status or, whatever, we don't take well to being told we're wrong. Right, so we're gonna double down on that. So maybe a prior thing before you can even get to what I was talking to Karen about is to find what we share. What's the outcome we want. So it's a sort of metacognitive level. It's you say to a person, "This ain't going good at the moment, is it? This is not what I want. I'd really like it if we could talk this through, and I really respect you, but we've obviously got a very different point of view." So you're taking care of that implicit self-protection, so you got to find the common ground before you can figure out why you disagree on the facts, if I put it that way. So you've kind of got to get the relationship sorted before you can talk about what you're disagreeing about, right? And all of us are biased, and we're not neutral about our biases. Like we get quite emotional about them, and especially when they're challenged. And so people often avoid having this conversation with another person because of that, because they know that I feel really intense, right? So that's a really, unsurprisingly, Chris, that's a really curly question. You've got a reputation for this, or at least I'm creating that reputation for you on this podcast. But I hope that's sort of a part of an answer. There's some preparatory work to do before you can really start talking about the 3 Ps or the two conditions test.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Who's next?
Well, and as a kind of follow-up to that, it must be complicated because some people, are they born that way? How much of it is learned? I mean, I'm sure it varies, but you know that more than me.
Yeah, well, it turns out, I mean, Martin Seligman, who is very, very famous psychologist, and he, as I said, worked for decades on optimism, pessimism. He's one of the founders of positive psychology. So he's, he's head of the American Psychological Association for a while. He's a very important figure. his view in his work, I don't know whether he's changed it, was that it's learned. Okay. But I think that's not necessarily everyone's view within psychology. So it's probably still a bit of an open question. So, for example, as you no doubt know, Colleen, I'm very interested in personality, and particularly how strongly genetic it is, right? And so some people are just naturally more open to experience. Some people are more, lower on agreeableness, for example. And that's probably going to interact with this. If you're low on openness and you're more disagreeable, it's going to be harder to change your mind.
And depending on how old you are and life experience.
Exactly.
Moldable.
And yeah. For example, even if we, were to talk about the skills that we're talking about today, what an advantage to learn this, have this knowledge and these skills, so that we can take that metacognitive stance and maybe we can start to practice in changes to our emotional and cognitive habits, our mindset habits. And in a way, I think that's what we're trying to do in life. We're trying to figure out what's helpful, what's wise, rather than what we feel is right. This is such a huge area of inquiry. I don't think it's ever been more relevant if you think about polarization and people's very strongly held differences of view and their animosity to each other. But the question of whether people are born like this, probably some people have more of a propensity to it, but then obviously what happens in your life is going to be very, very important. So
definitely. I think that so much of it stems from insecurity or that fear base. Control.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, this is the existential dilemma that's called being a human being. We are insecure. As I like to say, it's not going to end well. But we spend a fair bit of our life worrying about things not going well, right? And perhaps in another podcast we can talk about the evolutionary origins of that. But suffice it to say, our interpersonal status was and probably still is very central to our survival and whether we're thriving or not. So it makes perfect sense. It's rational to defend our status in the village. Even if it's not wise, it's not irrational in that sense. And in fact, we will our belonging and our status in our groups is actually more important to us than the truth value of what we're adhering to. And from a evolutionary point of view, that's completely rational. But obviously, in a sort of science-based view, that's completely irrational and unwise, because we live in a safer world. We don't necessarily have to cleave so closely to groups. Big implications for that question, Colin.
I think you're seeing that play out in U.S. politics too. It's better to be wrong and part of a group than to look at science and realize that it's right.
Yeah. That's right. And, but until we understand that, until we understand why there's sort of good reasons to be more interested in the belonging and the belief in this case that someone's going to look after my interests, people who followed Trump, for example, obviously many of them realised he was telling lies and this and that, but they had other larger interests at stake, willing to overlook those things because it's more important to them to feel like they were joining a group that was going to give them some agency and power.
Or the fear of it all being taken away.
Yeah, both at the same time. Exactly. So, now, Terry, did you have a question or an insight you wanted to share? Just generally?
I had just a thought, and I call it traffic karma. where I've learned to train myself to turn into an observer. When, someone comes smoking up beside me and,
Yeah.
cuts in my front, I go, I wonder what my odds are that by the time that I turn off, I'm actually ahead of this person.
Yes.
8 times out of like 10 I am, and I'm not doing anything different.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes me smile, and I go on my way. But
That's interesting.
I've just found that it like no longer bothers me. I observe it through a lens of, I wonder how this is going to work out.
Nice. A couple of things to say about that, Terry. I mean, it demonstrates that we can learn how to have more equanimity, more okayness when the reality outside us, is for most people is going to trigger negative emotion, right? And indeed, as no doubt in your past it has, but you've learned, right? And that's the great thing, that this knowledge about what's wise can carry us into the future in future interactions, right? And I think that's very, very important. The other thing there is, the two conditions test. It's like you go through it maybe 100 times before you eventually go, is this wise? Is this helpful? It's a bit like that saying, if someone's ignorant, let's say you're upset by them. What's that saying? Are you going to let them live rent-free in your head? I really like that, because it has that sense in which they've done something, and then we might be stewing on it for days, weeks, months, years. They're long gone. And so it's I think factually true to say that in those situations we're the ones upsetting ourselves, because they're no longer here. Right?
It's also, though, out of that is it's not like a classical zero sum where your loss by having them in your head is their benefit. They don't even know. It's only downside for the person that around.
You've given them control of your experience.
Yeah, but they don't even know that.
They don't even know.
Yeah, I just give them control of my curiosity.
Well, they're triggering now curiosity in you, which is you've practiced in a new habit that is much wiser.
Well, believe me, if you're driving kids to school in this city, you need it. I mean,
you get plenty of practice in the equanimity.
Monday was one of the best. There must have been like 8 things that happened. 2 by bus drivers, which you normally don't see. Usually they are the most sane people. But
Exactly.
they were doing moves that was backing traffic up across an intersection with a red light. It was just awesome.
I mean, for social psychologists, traffic is a gold mine. It's a treasure trove.
I just looked at all these people that had jammed up, thinking that they're going to beat the bus. The bus cut them off, and now they're all stuck in a red light, and no traffic can go the other way. And I'm just sitting there, just laughing.
Fantastic. So and of course, this all demonstrates this human freedom, the potential human freedom we have, in that we can't avoid these situations. That as you say, Terry, Monday's going to be like that.
Oh yeah.
But we can change the experience, and that's the key. That's where human freedom resides. And so sometimes, though, we have to surrender being right, because it's our righteousness that's upsetting us in the end. And if we can shift what we pay attention to and the way we're paying attention, we can create in our lives more positive experiences, more positive emotions, but always being balanced by not by ignoring reality, but by reappraising it. Alrighty, that's absolutely excellent. I'm not surprised, and I look forward to when we get together again to whatever our next podcast is. So take care, guys, and thank you so much.